Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of humanity's most enduring stories of faith, obedience, and survival against impossible odds. We're talking about Noah and the Ark, a tale that goes far beyond just animals boarding a boat. And before we start, just a heads up, you probably think you know this story. Not because it is simple. Well, maybe it seems that way on the surface. But if you really dig into what theologians, historians, and storytellers have been wrestling with for millennia, you'll realize this isn't just about a man building a boat. It is about divine judgment, human righteousness, environmental catastrophe, and the weight of being chosen to preserve life itself. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy diving deep into stories that have shaped civilizations and continue to resonate in our modern world. Also, I'd love to know what city you are watching from. And what is your take on environmental responsibility? Do we have a duty to preserve creation, or is that beyond human capability? Now, dim the lights, maybe grab something warm to drink, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. The world in Noah's time wasn't the peaceful pastoral scene you might imagine from children's books. According to the biblical account, humanity had become corrupt, not just individually, but systemically. The Hebrew text uses the word charmers violence, but not just any violence. This was pervasive, institutionalized brutality that had infected every aspect of human society. The book of Genesis tells us that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. That is not hyperbole that is describing a civilization that had lost its moral compass entirely. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about a world where compassion, justice, and mercy had become extinct concepts. But here is where it gets interesting. And this is something most people miss when they hear this story. The text doesn't just say people were doing bad things. It says the earth itself was corrupt and filled with violence. The very ground, the environment, the natural order had been poisoned by human behavior. Sound familiar in our age of climate change and environmental destruction? Maybe Noah's story isn't as ancient as we think. Now, in the midst of this moral wasteland, we meet Noah. The text describes him as righteous in his generation, and someone who walked with God. But here is the thing, and this is crucial. Noah wasn't righteous by some absolute standard. He was righteous compared to everyone else alive at the time. It is like being the best swimmer on a sinking ship. The Hebrew word for righteous here is tzaddik. It doesn't mean perfect. It means someone who maintains their integrity despite the world around them. Noah was a man who, when everyone else was cutting corners, taking shortcuts, and embracing corruption, somehow maintained his moral center. That is not easy to do. Ask anyone who has tried to maintain their principles in a toxic workplace or corrupt system. But Noah wasn't just passively righteous. The text says he walked with God. The same phrase used to describe Enoch, who was taken up to heaven without dying. This walking with God implies an active relationship, a daily choice to align yourself with divine, rather than human convenience. Now, let's talk about what the world looked like practically. Ancient Jewish and Christian commentators have painted a picture of a society that sounds eerily modern in some ways. They describe a world of technological advancement without moral progress. People were building cities, creating weapons, developing agriculture. But they were using all these advances to oppress, exploit, and destroy. The Nephilim are mentioned in these early chapters, mysterious beings that were the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Whatever these beings were exactly, they seem to represent the ultimate corruption of the natural order. Some scholars suggest they were the result of fallen angels interbreeding with humans. Others think they were the descendants of Seth's lineage intermarrying with Cain's lineage, mixing the godly with the ungodly. But here is what is really fascinating. The flood narrative appears in cultures all around the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in ancient Mesopotamia, tells of Utnapishtim, who builds a great ship to survive a worldwide flood. Hindu texts speak of Manu, who saves humanity from a great deluge. The Greeks had Deucalion and Pyrrha. Native American tribes have flood stories. Aboriginal Australians have flood stories. Either there was some kind of catastrophic flooding event in human prehistory that got embedded in cultural memory, or this story represents something so fundamental about human nature and divine justice that it appears independently in cultures that had no contact with each other. So when God looks down and sees this corrupted world, the response isn't immediate anger. It is something more complex. The text says God regretted making humanity. The Hebrew word is nachem. It means to be sorry, to grieve, to change one's mind. This isn't a capricious deity throwing a tantrum. This is a creator heartbroken by what creation has become. Now, imagine you are Noah. You are living your life, trying to maintain your integrity in a world gone mad. And suddenly you hear the voice of God, not in a dream, not in a vision, but as clear as if someone were standing next to you. And what does God say? I am going to destroy the world, but I want you to build a boat. The Hebrew word for the vessel Noah was commanded to build is tebah. It is not the usual word for ship or boat. In fact, it is only used 2 other times in the Bible, once for the basket that baby Moses was placed in, and once more in this story. The word implies something that floats, something that preserves life, but not something that is meant to be navigated. Noah wasn't building a ship to sail somewhere. He was building a floating sanctuary. The instructions God gives are incredibly specific. The ark was to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Using the standard Hebrew cubit of about 18 inches, we're talking about a vessel roughly 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. That is enormous, about the size of a modern cruise ship, but built entirely of wood. But here is where it gets really interesting. Modern naval architects have studied these dimensions, and they've concluded that this ratio, 30 hours, 50 minutes and 30 seconds, is almost perfectly designed for stability in rough waters. It is not built for speed or maneuverability. It is built to survive the worst conditions imaginable while keeping its cargo safe. The construction details are fascinating too. God tells Noah to make it of gopher wood, and honestly, nobody knows exactly what gopher wood is. The word appears nowhere else in the Bible. Some scholars think it might be cypress, others suggest cedar. Some even think gopher might not refer to a type of wood at all, but to a method of construction, perhaps laminated wood or some kind of composite material. The ark was to be covered inside and out with pitch, a tar-like substance that would make it waterproof. But the Hebrew word used here is kopher, which literally means covering or atonement. The same word is used later in the Bible for the price paid to redeem a life. So even in the construction details, there is this theme of preservation and redemption. Now, let's talk about the timeline. How long did it take Noah to build the ark? The Bible doesn't give us exact numbers, but it tells us that Noah was 500 years old when he began having sons, and 600 years old when the flood came. His sons were old enough to be married when the flood occurred, which suggests they were at least in their teens or 20s. So Noah had somewhere between 50 and 100 years to build this ark. That might seem like a long time, but consider what he was up against. This wasn't just a construction project, it was a complete lifestyle change. Noah had to learn shipbuilding, gather materials, and somehow convince his family to go along with this seemingly insane plan. And think about the social pressure. Noah is living in a world where everyone else is focused on immediate gratification, where violence and corruption are the norm, and he is spending decades building a massive boat in a world where it might never rain. The ridicule must have been constant. The doubt must have been crushing. But here is what I find remarkable about Noah's response to God's command. The text simply says, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. No questions, no negotiations, no requests for clarification, just obedience. In Hebrew, the phrase is ken asah, so he did. It is the same phrase used when God speaks creation to existence. And it was so. This isn't blind obedience, though. Remember, Noah walked with God. This was a man who had an ongoing relationship with the divine. When God spoke, Noah recognized the voice. When God gave instructions, Noah understood the gravity of what was being asked. But imagine the practical challenges. Where do you get that much wood? How do you transport it? How do you cut it to size? How do you join pieces together to create a watertight vessel? Keep in mind, this is before modern tools, before cranes, before any kind of mechanical assistance. This would have been an almost impossible task for one family. Some scholars suggest that Noah might have hired help, that in the early stages of construction, before the corruption became complete, there might have been others willing to work on the project. But ultimately, it was Noah and his family who would have to finish the job, because by the time the flood came, they were the only righteous people left. The ark wasn't just a boat, it was a statement of faith. Every day Noah worked on it. He was declaring his belief that God would do what he said he would do. Every plank he laid, every joint he sealed, every room he constructed was an act of trust in a promise that seemed impossible. And here is something else to consider. Noah was building the ark before he fully understood what it would preserve. God had told him to bring animals, but the full scope of what Noah was being asked to do wouldn't become clear until later. He was building in faith, not in complete understanding. Now, as we move deeper into the story, we need to talk about what happened next, the gathering of the animals. And this is where things get really interesting, because the logistics of this operation are mind-boggling. First, let's clear up a common misconception. The popular image of Noah's Ark shows two of every animal marching up a gangplank like they're boarding a cruise ship. But that is not what the Bible actually says. According to the text, Noah was commanded to take 7 pairs of every clean animal and 1 pair of every unclean animal. The distinction between clean and unclean animals wouldn't be formally codified until Moses received the law centuries later. But the concept clearly existed in Noah's time. Clean animals were those suitable for sacrifice, and, later, for food. Unclean animals were those considered unsuitable for these purposes. So we're talking about 14 of each clean animal, and 2 of each unclean animal. That is still a lot of animals, but it is not quite as overwhelming as 2 of absolutely everything. But here is where it gets really fascinating. The text says the animals came to Noah. He didn't have to go hunting around the world, trying to capture polar bears and penguins and kangaroos. Somehow, by divine instinct or supernatural direction, representatives of every species made their way to the ark. Think about what that would have looked like. Over the course of days or weeks, animals would have been arriving at Noah's construction site. Lions walking peacefully alongside zebras, bears meandering along with salmon, wolves travelling in the same direction as sheep, the natural order of predator and prey temporarily suspended by divine intervention. The Hebrew word used to describe the animals coming to Noah is bo. It means to come, to enter, to go in. It is the same word used when God invites people to come to him. There is something almost liturgical about this gathering, as if the animals were responding to a divine call that transcended their natural instincts. Now, let's talk about the practical challenges. How do you feed a floating zoo? How do you keep carnivores from eating herbivores? How do you manage waste? How do you provide fresh water? How do you keep the animals calm in a confined space during what would have been the most terrifying storm in history? Ancient Jewish commentators addressed some of these questions in fascinating ways. Some suggested that the animals went into a state of hibernation or dormancy during the flood, reducing their need for food and water. Others proposed that God provided a supernatural food source, perhaps manna-like substances that met the nutritional needs of every species. The Talmud suggests that Noah and his family didn't sleep for the entire year they were on the ark, because they were constantly tending to the animals. Each species had its own feeding schedule, its own needs, its own requirements. The lions needed to be fed at one time, the birds at another, the reptiles at yet another. But here is what is really remarkable. This wasn't just about preservation. This was about restoration. Noah wasn't just saving animals from extinction. He was preparing for the repopulation of the earth. The clean animals taken in groups of 7 would provide stock for sacrifice and food. The unclean animals taken in pairs would rebuild the ecosystem. The timing of the animals' arrival was crucial too. They didn't all show up at once. That would have been chaos. They arrived in an orderly fashion, as if following some kind of divine schedule. Smaller animals first, then medium-sized ones, Then the largest animals last. By the time the elephants and hippos arrived, the infrastructure was in place to accommodate them. And think about Noah's family during this time. His wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. 8 people total, watching this unprecedented gathering of the animal kingdom. This would have been simultaneously terrifying and awe-inspiring. They were witnessing something that had never happened before and would never happen again. The Bible tells us that Noah's sons were named Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem's name means name or reputation. Ham's name means hot or warm. Japheth's name means beauty or expansion. Some scholars see prophetic significance in these names. Shem would be the ancestor of the Semitic peoples, including the Israelites. Ham would be the ancestor of the African peoples. Japheth would be the ancestor of the Indo-European peoples. But in the context of the flood story, these weren't just names, they were representatives of all humanity. When Noah's family entered the ark, they were carrying the genetic future of the human race. The weight of that responsibility must have been crushing. Now imagine the external pressure building as the animals gathered. The people in the surrounding area would have noticed this unprecedented migration. Word would have spread. Crowds would have gathered. The mockery that Noah had endured for decades would have intensified. "Look at the crazy old man and his zoo," they might have laughed. "What is he planning to do with all those animals? Start a circus?" But there would have been some who felt uneasy. The sheer scale of what was happening, the supernatural nature of the animal gathering, the obvious preparation for something catastrophic. Some people must have wondered if Noah knew something they didn't. The text suggests that God gave Noah a 7-day warning before the flood began. 7 days to make final preparations, to load the last of the supplies, to say goodbye to the world they had known. Can you imagine those 7 days? The tension, the anticipation, the fear, the faith all mixed together. And then, on the 7th day, something unprecedented happened. The text says that Noah, his family, and all the animals entered the ark. But then it says something interesting. Then the Lord shut him in. God himself closed the door of the ark. This wasn't just about keeping water out. It was about keeping Noah's family safe. But it was also about finality. Once that door was closed, now we come to the moment everything changes. The Bible describes the beginning of the flood in language that is both poetic and terrifying. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. This isn't just rain. This is a complete unravelling of the world's water systems. The springs of the great deep, the Hebrew phrase is, Ma no tehem rabah, refers to massive underground water sources. Some scholars think this might describe tectonic activity, massive earthquakes that would have released underground water reservoirs and changed the landscape permanently. The floodgates of the heavens. Arubot Hashemayim literally means the windows of heaven. Ancient peoples understood the sky as a solid dome holding back waters above. When these windows opened, it wasn't just rain. It was as if the very structure of creation was being undone. And the rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. In biblical numerology, 40 is the number of testing, of trial, of transformation. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. The Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus fasted for 40 days. This wasn't just a long rainstorm, it was a cosmic judgment that would transform the world. But here is something most people miss: the water didn't just fall from above. It came from below too. The text makes it clear that the flood was caused by water from both directions. The earth's crust was breaking apart, releasing underground water sources while unprecedented amounts of water fell from the sky. This was geological catastrophe on a scale that is hard to imagine. Now, think about what this would have been like for Noah and his family. They're sealed inside this wooden ark with hundreds of animals, and outside the world is literally being torn apart. The noise would have been deafening, the motion would have been terrifying, the ark would have been tossed around like a toy in a bathtub. The text says the water increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. That word, floated, in Hebrew, is halak. It means to walk, to go, to move. The ark didn't just sit still on the water, it was moving, travelling, being carried by the currents and the wind. For 15 cubits, about 22 feet, the water rose above the highest mountains. Think about that. The entire landscape of the world was submerged under more than 20 feet of water. Every hill, every mountain, every high place was underwater. The earth had become a featureless ocean. The text says, "Every living thing that moved on land perished: birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died." The Hebrew word for perished is gava. It means to expire, to die, to breathe one's last breath. This wasn't just death, it was extinction. Only Noah, and those with him in the ark, were left alive. 8 people, and whatever animals they had managed to preserve. The entire population of the earth, reduced to the contents of one wooden vessel. Now, let's think about the psychological impact of this on Noah's family. They had watched their entire world die. Every person they had ever known, every place they had ever been, every landmark, every city, every field, all of it was gone. They were the sole survivors of the complete destruction of human civilization. The guilt must have been overwhelming. Why them? Why were they saved when everyone else perished? The loneliness must have been crushing. They were the only human beings left alive on Earth. The responsibility must have been terrifying. The future of the human race depended entirely on them. But here is what is remarkable: the text doesn't record any complaints from Noah's family. No arguments, no despair, no giving up. They had committed themselves to this path, and they were going to see it through. The ark drifted for 150 days before the water began to recede. That is 5 months of floating on an endless ocean, caring for animals, rationing food and water, and trying to maintain hope that this nightmare would eventually end. Can you imagine the monotony? Day after day of the same routine. Feed the animals, clean the pens, check for leaks, pray, sleep, wake up and do it all over again. No land in sight, no other human beings, no way to know if the flood would ever end. But God didn't forget them. The text says, God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. That word remembered in Hebrew is zakar. It doesn't just mean to recall something, it means to act on behalf of someone, to show covenant faithfulness. God sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. The springs of the deep were closed, and the floodgates of the heavens were shut. The rain stopped. The water began to go down. After 150 days, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Now, where exactly is Ararat? The Bible doesn't say Mount Ararat. It says the mountains of Ararat. Ararat was a region, not a specific mountain. It was located in what is now eastern Turkey, near the borders of Armenia and Iran. The ark came to rest somewhere in this mountainous region, but the exact location remains a mystery. People have been searching for Noah's Ark for centuries. There have been countless expeditions, satellite surveys, and archaeological investigations. Some claim to have found evidence of the Ark's remains, but nothing has been definitively proven. Maybe that is intentional. Maybe the Ark isn't meant to be found. Maybe its significance isn't in its physical remains, but in its spiritual meaning. Now we come to one of the most poignant parts of the story, the waiting period, after the ark came to rest. The text tells us that Noah waited, and waited, and waited some more. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat on the 17th day of the 7th month. But Noah didn't immediately throw open the doors and rush outside. He waited another 2.5 months until the tops of the mountains became visible. Even then, he didn't leave the ark. He waited another 40 days. Think about the self-control this required. After months of confinement, after watching the world die, after enduring the most traumatic experience in human history, Noah still had the discipline to wait for the right time. He didn't let desperation or cabin fever drive him to make poor decisions. And then Noah did something brilliant. He sent out a raven. Ravens are scavengers. They can eat almost anything, including carrion. If there were dead animals floating on the water, the raven would find food and might not return. If the raven came back, it would mean there wasn't enough dry land to support life yet. The text says the raven kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. It didn't find a place to land, so it kept returning to the ark. This told Noah that the world wasn't ready yet. 7 days later, Noah sent out a dove. Doves are more particular about their food. They need fresh vegetation, clean water, and dry land. If the dove returned, it would mean the world still wasn't ready for habitation. The dove came back. There was nowhere for it to land, nowhere for it to find food. Noah waited another 7 days and sent the dove out again. This time, the dove returned with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak. This wasn't just any leaf, it was an olive leaf, green and fresh. Olive trees are remarkably resilient. They can survive underwater for months and still produce new growth. This olive leaf was a sign that the earth was coming back to life. But Noah still didn't leave the ark. He waited another 7 days and sent the dove out a third time. This time, the dove didn't return. It had found a place to make its home. The earth was ready. Now, here is something fascinating about these birds. In ancient Near Eastern literature, both ravens and doves were associated with finding dry land after floods. But in the biblical account, they take on deeper symbolic meaning. The raven, which feeds on death and decay, represents the old world that was passing away. The dove, which requires clean, fresh conditions, represents the new world that was being born. The olive leaf becomes a symbol of peace, of God's mercy, of the covenant between God and creation. Even today, we use the dove with an olive branch as a symbol of peace. We probably don't realize that we're referencing this ancient story of hope emerging from judgment, of life returning after death, of mercy following wrath. But Noah still didn't leave the ark until God specifically told him to. Can you imagine the restraint this required? The dove hadn't returned. The tops of the mountains were visible, and the ground was probably dry enough to support life. But Noah waited for divine permission. This speaks to something profound about Noah's character. He wasn't just obedient when it was convenient. He was obedient when it was difficult. He had learned to wait on God's timing, not his own. He had learned that divine instructions weren't just suggestions, they were life and death commands. Finally, after more than a year in the ark, God spoke to Noah. "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it." The Hebrew word for come out is yatzah. It means to go forth, to proceed, to emerge. It is the same word used when God calls Abraham to leave his homeland, when God calls Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, when God calls his people to move forward into new territory. Noah and his family had entered the ark as refugees fleeing judgment. They emerged as pioneers entering a new world. They had gone in as survivors. They came out as founders of a new civilization. The first thing Noah did when he left the ark was build an altar. After everything he had been through, after all the trauma and loss and uncertainty, his first act was worship. He took some of the clean animals and birds and sacrificed them to God. This might seem strange to us. Noah had just spent more than a year preserving animal life, and now he is killing some of them. But this wasn't cruelty, it was gratitude. This was Noah's way of saying, "Thank you for saving us, thank you for giving us another chance. Thank you for not giving up on humanity." The text says that when God smelled the pleasing aroma of Noah's sacrifice, he made a promise. "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done." This is remarkable. God acknowledges that human nature hasn't changed. People are still going to be selfish, violent, and corrupt. But God promises that he will never again destroy the world with a flood. Instead, he will work with humanity, despite their flaws, to accomplish his purposes. Now we come to one of the most beautiful and significant moments in the entire biblical narrative: the establishment of the Rainbow Covenant. After Noah's sacrifice, God makes a series of promises that would shape the relationship between heaven and earth for all time. First, God blessed Noah and his sons, saying, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." This is almost identical to the blessing God gave to Adam and Eve in the garden. It is as if God is pressing the reset button on human history, giving humanity another chance to fulfill their original purpose. But there are some important differences. When God blessed Adam and Eve, he told them to subdue the earth and rule over the animals. The Hebrew word suggested a gentle, caring dominion. Now, God tells Noah that the fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth, and on all the birds in the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish in the sea. The relationship between humans and animals has changed. The harmony that existed in Eden has been broken. Animals will now fear humans, and humans will have to work harder to survive. This isn't a punishment. It is a recognition of the new reality after the flood. God also gives Noah permission to eat meat. Before the flood, humans were apparently vegetarian. Now, God says, "Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything." But there is a crucial limitation. You must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. This is the first dietary law in the Bible, and it is given to all humanity, not just to the Israelites. The principle is that life belongs to God, and even when we take life for food, we must do so with respect and acknowledgement of what we're doing. Then God makes an even more significant statement. "And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal. And from each human being too, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind." This is the foundation of human justice systems. Murder is wrong not just because it hurts people or disrupts society, but because it destroys something that bears God's image. Every human life has inherent worth and dignity, because every human being reflects something of the divine nature. But the most amazing part comes next. God says, "I establish my covenant with you, and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth." This covenant isn't just with Noah's family, it is with every living creature on earth. God is making a promise to all of creation, plants, animals, humans, everything. This is the first truly universal covenant in the Bible. And what does God promise? Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. Then God gives the sign of this covenant. "I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind." Now, here is something interesting. The Hebrew word for rainbow is kesheth, which also means bow, as in a weapon used for hunting or warfare. Some scholars suggest that God is essentially hanging up his bow, setting aside his weapon of judgment as a sign that he will not wage war against the earth in this way again. Every time we see a rainbow, we're seeing God's promise to never again destroy the world with a flood. It is a reminder of his mercy, his faithfulness, and his commitment to working with creation rather than against it. But think about when rainbows appear. They come after storms. When the sun shines through the rain, they're a sign that the storm is over, that light is breaking through the darkness. In the context of Noah's story, the rainbow represents hope emerging from judgment, beauty arising from catastrophe, promise following destruction. The rainbow covenant is unconditional. It doesn't depend on human behavior or faithfulness. God isn't saying, "I won't flood the earth again as long as you are good." He is saying, "I won't flood the earth again, period." This is divine grace at its most fundamental level, and here is what is remarkable: this covenant has never been broken. In the thousands of years since Noah, there have been devastating floods, but never again has the entire earth been covered with water. God has kept his promise. The rainbow becomes a symbol of hope, that transcends the biblical narrative. It appears in cultures all around the world as a sign of promise, of connection between heaven and earth, of beauty emerging from storm. Even people who don't know the story of Noah instinctively understand that rainbows represent something good, something hopeful, something that makes the world a better place. But the covenant comes with responsibilities too. Humans are called to be stewards of creation, protectors of life, guardians of the image of God in one another. The rainbow isn't just a promise, it is a commission. Every time we see it, we're reminded not just of what God has promised to do, but of what we're called to do in response. Now, let's talk about what happened after the flood, because the story doesn't end with Noah stepping off the ark. In fact, some of the most challenging and complex parts of the narrative come after the Rainbow Covenant. Noah and his family found themselves in a completely transformed world. The landscape had been reshaped by the flood. The climate had changed. The ecosystems had been disrupted. They were essentially starting human civilization from scratch. The first thing they had to do was figure out how to survive. They needed shelter, food, water, and protection from the elements. They had to learn how to farm in soil that had been underwater for more than a year. They had to domesticate animals that had been wild. They had to develop new technologies for their new environment, but they also had to deal with the psychological trauma of what they had experienced. They were the only survivors of a global catastrophe. Everyone they had ever known was dead. They were completely alone in the world, responsible for rebuilding everything from the ground up. The text tells us that Noah began to be a man of the soil and planted a vineyard. This might seem like a small detail, but it is actually quite significant. Noah wasn't just surviving, he was planning for the future. Grapevines take years to mature and produce fruit. By planting a vineyard, Noah was making a statement of faith in the future, an investment in long-term prosperity. But then something troubling happens. The text says that Noah drank some of the wine, became drunk, and lay uncovered inside his tent. His son Ham saw his father's nakedness and told his brothers about it. Shem and Japheth took a garment and walked backward into the tent to cover their father without looking at him. When Noah woke up and found out what had happened, he cursed Ham's son Canaan, saying he would be a servant to his brothers. But he blessed Shem and Japheth, predicting that they would prosper and that Canaan would serve them. This is one of the most difficult passages in the Noah story, and it has been misinterpreted and misused throughout history. Some have used it to justify slavery or racial discrimination, claiming that certain ethnic groups are cursed to be servants. This is a complete misunderstanding of the text. First, the curse isn't on Ham, it is on Canaan, one of Ham's sons. Second, this isn't about race or ethnicity, it is about behavior and character. Third, the curse is more of a prophecy about what will happen rather than a divine decree about what should happen. The real issue here isn't the nakedness itself, but the response to it. In ancient Near Eastern culture, seeing your father's nakedness was considered a serious violation of family honor. But more than that, Ham's response telling his brothers about it rather than quietly covering his father showed a lack of respect and compassion. Shem and Japheth, on the other hand, handled the situation with dignity and respect. They covered their father without looking, preserving his honor and their own. This incident reveals character who can be trusted with family secrets, who shows respect for authority, who acts with wisdom in difficult situations. What is really tragic about this story is that it shows how quickly human nature reasserted itself after the flood. Noah, the righteous man who walked with God, made a serious mistake. His family, who had been preserved by divine grace, immediately fell into patterns of dysfunction and conflict. This is a reminder that the flood didn't change human nature. People were still capable of poor judgment, family conflicts, and moral failures. The new world wasn't automatically better than the old world. It was just a world with fewer people and another chance to get things right. But there is something else important happening here. Noah's prophecy about his sons becomes a template for understanding how the world would be repopulated. Shem would become the ancestor of the Semitic peoples, including the Israelites. Japheth would become the ancestor of the Indo-European peoples. Ham would become the ancestor of various peoples, including the Egyptians and the Canaanites. This isn't about racial superiority or divine favoritism. It is about the consequences of choices. The descendants of Shem and Japheth would generally be characterized by wisdom, respect for authority, and covenant faithfulness. The descendants of Ham would often be characterized by rebellion, idolatry, and conflict with God's purposes. But even this isn't absolute. Some of Ham's descendants, like the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts, became faithful followers of God. Some of Shem's descendants, like the Israelites who worshipped the golden calf, proved unfaithful. Character isn't determined by ancestry, it is determined by choices. Now, the story of Noah connects directly to another famous biblical narrative, the Tower of Babel. After the flood, Noah's descendants began to multiply and spread across the earth. But instead of continuing to spread out as God had commanded, they decided to build a great city with a tower that reached to the heavens. The text says, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." This wasn't just about architecture, it was about human ambition, and the desire to be like God. The tower wasn't just tall, it was supposed to reach to the heavens, to bridge the gap between earth and the divine realm. The people wanted to make a name for themselves, to achieve immortality through their own efforts, rather than through relationship with God. But there is something else going on here, they said. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. But God had specifically commanded them to scatter, to fill the earth, to spread out and populate the world. By building this city and tower, they were directly defying God's command. This connects back to Noah's story in important ways. Noah had been obedient to God's instructions, even when they seemed impossible or unreasonable. His descendants were choosing disobedience, even when God's instructions were clear and beneficial. The Tower of Babel represents human civilization's tendency to try to reach God through technology, achievement, and collective effort, rather than through humility, faith, and obedience. It is the same impulse that led to the corruption before the flood, the desire to be autonomous, to be gods rather than to serve God. God's response was to confuse their languages and scatter them across the earth. This wasn't just punishment, it was mercy. If humanity had succeeded in building their tower, if they had achieved their goal of making a name for themselves, they would have become even more prideful and rebellious than they already were. The scattering at Babel explains how Noah's descendants spread across the world and developed into different cultures, languages, and nations. It is the biblical explanation for human diversity, not as a result of evolution or random chance, but as a result of divine intervention designed to prevent human pride from becoming destructive. But even this judgment contains a promise. The scattering at Babel would eventually be reversed at Pentecost, when people from every nation heard the gospel in their own languages. The division caused by human pride would be healed by divine grace. So what can we learn from Noah's story? What does it mean for us today, thousands of years later? First, Noah's story is about the reality of divine judgment. God takes sin seriously. The corruption and violence that characterized the pre-flood world wasn't something God could simply ignore or overlook. There are consequences for individual and collective moral failures, but Noah's story is also about divine mercy. Even in the midst of judgment, God provided a way of escape. The ark wasn't just about preservation, it was about salvation. God didn't want to destroy humanity, he wanted to redeem it. Second, Noah's story is about the importance of faith and obedience. Noah believed God even when God's instructions seemed impossible. He obeyed God even when obedience was difficult, costly, and socially awkward. He trusted God's timing even when it meant waiting longer than he wanted to wait. In our culture of instant gratification and constant connectivity, Noah's patient obedience is a powerful counter-narrative. Sometimes the right thing to do is to wait, to trust, to obey even when we don't understand the full picture. Third, Noah's story is about environmental stewardship. Noah wasn't just saving his own family, he was preserving the entire ecosystem. He understood that humans have a responsibility to care for the natural world, to protect endangered species, to maintain the balance of creation in our current age of climate change and environmental destruction. Noah's example is more relevant than ever. We're called to be caretakers of creation, not just consumers of natural resources. Fourth, Noah's story is about the importance of family and community. Noah didn't face the flood alone, he had his family with him. They worked together, suffered together, and survived together. In times of crisis, our relationships become crucial for survival and recovery. Fifth, Noah's story is about new beginnings. Even after the most catastrophic judgment in history, God didn't give up on humanity. He made a covenant, established a new relationship, and gave people another chance to fulfill their purpose. No matter how badly we've messed up, no matter how far we've fallen, no matter how hopeless our situation seems, God is still in the business of new beginnings. The rainbow is still a sign of hope, of promise, of divine commitment to working with us rather than against us. But Noah's story also warns us about the persistence of human nature. The flood didn't solve the problem of human sin and corruption. Noah himself made serious mistakes after the flood. His descendants quickly fell into patterns of pride and disobedience. This reminds us that external circumstances don't automatically change internal character. We can't solve human problems just by changing laws, or governments, or technologies. Real change has to happen at the level of the heart, through personal transformation and spiritual renewal. Now, let's talk about how Noah's story has been understood and interpreted throughout history. Because this ancient narrative has had an enormous impact on human culture, literature, and thought. In Jewish tradition, Noah is considered one of the most righteous men who ever lived. The Talmud describes him as perfect in his generation, and praises his patience, his faithfulness, and his care for the animals. Some Jewish commentators even suggest that Noah's righteousness was greater than Abraham's, because Noah maintained his faith in a completely corrupt world, while Abraham lived among people who were at least partially receptive to God. However, other Jewish commentators are more critical of Noah. They point out that he didn't intercede for the wicked as Abraham did for Sodom and Gomorrah. They suggest that Noah was righteous only in comparison to his extremely wicked contemporaries, but that he wouldn't have been considered righteous in a better generation. This debate about Noah's character continues to this day. Was he a perfect man who maintained his integrity in impossible circumstances? Or was he simply the best of a bad lot, righteous only by comparison? The text seems to support both interpretations, which makes Noah a complex and fascinating character. In Christian tradition, Noah is seen as a type or foreshadowing of Jesus Christ. Just as Noah saved his family from the flood, Jesus saves humanity from the judgment of sin. Just as Noah's Ark provided the only way of escape from the flood, Jesus provides the only way of escape from spiritual death. The Apostle Peter draws this parallel explicitly, saying that baptism is like the flood. It represents death to the old life and resurrection to the new life. The Ark becomes a symbol of the church, the community of believers who find safety and salvation through faith in Christ. Christian art and literature have been deeply influenced by Noah's story. Medieval cathedrals often depicted scenes from the flood. Renaissance painters created masterpieces showing Noah's sacrifice or the animals entering the ark. Modern Christian writers continue to find inspiration in Noah's faith and obedience. In Islamic tradition, Noah, called Nuh, is considered one of the most important prophets. The Quran tells a similar story of Noah's preaching, the building of the ark, and the great flood. Islamic commentators emphasize Noah's role as a warner, someone who called people to repentance and righteousness before the judgment came. But Noah's influence extends far beyond religious traditions. The flood narrative has become a fundamental part of Western literature and culture. Writers like John Milton, Lord Byron, and more recently, writers like Darren Aronofsky in his film Noah, have reimagined and reinterpreted the story for new generations. The story has also influenced environmental movements. Noah's role as the preserver of species has made him a symbol of conservation and environmental protection. Organizations working to save endangered species often reference Noah's Ark as a model for their work. Scientists have also been fascinated by Noah's story. Geologists have looked for evidence of a worldwide flood. Archaeologists have searched for remains of the Ark. Marine biologists have studied whether it would have been possible to fit representatives of all species into a vessel of the Ark's dimensions. While the scientific evidence for a worldwide flood is limited, the story continues to raise important questions about human responsibility for the environment, the relationship between divine judgment and natural disasters, and the possibility of new beginnings after catastrophic events. Now, let's talk about why Noah's story still matters today. In our 21st century world of technology, global communication, and scientific advancement, what relevance does an ancient story about a man building a boat have for us? First, consider the environmental parallels. Noah lived in a world where human behavior had corrupted the earth itself. The ground was filled with violence, and the natural order had been disrupted by human actions. Sound familiar? Today, we face climate change, mass extinction, pollution, and environmental degradation on a scale that rivals the pre-flood world. Scientists warn that we're in the midst of the sixth great extinction event in Earth's history, with species disappearing at rates comparable to the great die-offs of the past. Noah's role as the preserver of species, as the one responsible for maintaining biodiversity, speaks directly to our current environmental crisis. We're called to be modern Noahs, working to preserve endangered species, protect ecosystems, and restore the balance of creation. Second, consider the social parallels. Noah lived in a world characterized by violence, corruption, and moral decay. The text says that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. While that might seem like hyperbole, it describes a society where injustice, oppression, and brutality had become normalized. Today, we see similar patterns in many parts of the world. Human trafficking, genocide, systemic oppression, and institutionalized violence continue to plague human society. The corruption that characterized Noah's world isn't just ancient history, it is contemporary reality. But Noah's story also offers hope. Even in the darkest times, even when corruption seems total, God can work through faithful individuals to preserve life and create new possibilities. Noah wasn't a superhero, he was just a man who chose to maintain his integrity when everyone else was compromising theirs. Third, consider the technological parallels. The pre-flood world was apparently quite advanced technologically. They had developed agriculture, metallurgy, and urban planning. But they used their technological advances to increase oppression rather than to serve human flourishing. Today, we have unprecedented technological capabilities. We can communicate instantly across the globe, manipulate genetic codes, and create artificial intelligence. But we're also using these technologies to create new forms of warfare, surveillance, and social control. Noah's story reminds us that technological advancement without moral progress is dangerous. The question isn't whether we can build something, but whether we should build it. The question isn't whether we can do something, but whether doing it serves the greater good. Fourth, consider the spiritual parallels. Noah's world had lost its connection to the divine. People had become so focused on their own desires and ambitions that they couldn't hear God's voice anymore. They had created a culture where spiritual values were irrelevant, and material success was the only measure of worth. Today, we live in an increasingly secular world where spiritual concerns are often dismissed as irrelevant or outdated. Many people live as if God doesn't exist, or at least as if God's existence doesn't matter for practical decision-making. But Noah's story suggests that spiritual disconnection leads to moral corruption, which leads to social breakdown, which leads to environmental destruction. The flood wasn't just about God's anger, it was about the inevitable consequences of living as if spiritual reality doesn't matter. Fifth, consider the hope parallels. Noah's story isn't ultimately about judgment, it is about salvation. Even in the midst of catastrophic destruction, God provided a way of escape. Even when the world seemed hopeless, God was working to create new possibilities. Today, when we face seemingly impossible challenges, climate change, political polarization, economic inequality, global pandemics, Noah's story reminds us that God specializes in new beginnings. The rainbow is still a sign of hope, a promise that destruction doesn't have the final word. But Noah's story also reminds us that hope requires action. Noah didn't just pray for salvation, he built an ark. He didn't just believe in God's promises, he acted on them. He didn't just hope for a better future, he prepared for it. As we reach the end of our journey through Noah's story, I want to talk about what makes this narrative eternally significant. Why has this story survived for thousands of years? Why does it continue to resonate with people from every culture, every religion, every background? I think it is because Noah's story addresses the most fundamental questions of human existence. Why is there suffering in the world? Why do good people suffer while evil people prosper? Is there any meaning to human history, or is it just random chaos? Is there hope for humanity, or are we doomed to repeat the same mistakes forever? Noah's story suggests that there is a moral order to the universe, that actions have consequences, that justice ultimately prevails. But it also suggests that mercy is greater than judgment, that love is stronger than wrath, that hope is more powerful than despair. The flood represents the worst that can happen to humanity: complete destruction, total loss, the end of everything we know and love. But even in the midst of that ultimate catastrophe, God provides a way of escape. Even when everything seems lost, there is still reason to hope. The ark represents the possibility of salvation in the midst of judgment. It is not earned through good works or moral perfection. Noah was righteous, but he wasn't perfect. It is offered as a gift of grace to those who have faith to receive it. The animals in the ark represent the inclusiveness of God's salvation. It is not just for one family, one tribe, one nation. It is for all of creation, for every living thing that draws breath. The rainbow represents the permanence of God's promise. It is not conditional on human behavior or dependent on human faithfulness. It is an unconditional covenant that demonstrates God's commitment to working with creation rather than destroying it. But perhaps most importantly, Noah's story is about the possibility of new beginnings. No matter how badly we've messed up, no matter how far we've fallen, no matter how hopeless our situation seems, it is never too late to start over. The God who gave Noah and his family a second chance is still giving people second chances today. This doesn't mean that consequences disappear or that suffering ends. Noah and his family still had to deal with the psychological trauma of surviving the flood. They still had to work hard to rebuild civilization. They still made mistakes and faced challenges. But it does mean that failure doesn't have to be final. Destruction doesn't have to be the end of the story. There is always the possibility of redemption, restoration, and renewal. In our current world, facing the challenges of climate change, political polarization, economic inequality, and social fragmentation, Noah's story offers both warning and hope. It warns us that actions have consequences, that corruption leads to destruction, that we can't ignore moral and spiritual reality without paying a price. But it also offers hope, that even in the darkest times, even when everything seems lost, God is still working to create new possibilities. The rainbow is still there after the storm. The dove still returns with an olive branch. The ark still floats on the waters of chaos. And maybe that is the most important lesson of Noah's story, that we're called to be ark builders in our own generation. We're called to preserve what is valuable, to protect what is vulnerable, to maintain hope when everything seems hopeless. We're called to be people who listen for God's voice, even when everyone else is making too much noise to hear it. We're called to be people who obey God's instructions, even when they seem impossible or impractical. We're called to be people who maintain our integrity, even when everyone else is compromising theirs. We're called to be people who care for creation, who protect the vulnerable, who work for justice, who maintain hope. We're called to be people who build arks, not literal boats, but communities of faith, institutions of learning, movements of justice, networks of care. We're called to be people who watch for rainbows, who recognize signs of hope even in the midst of the storm, who believe that God's promises are still true even when everything seems to be falling apart. That is the legacy of Noah. That is the challenge of his story. That is the hope it offers to every generation, including ours. So here we are, at the end of our deep dive into the story of Noah and the ark. We've explored the corruption of the pre-flood world, the call to build the ark, the gathering of the animals, the catastrophic flood, the long wait for dry land, the rainbow covenant, and the challenges of starting over in a new world. But in many ways, we're not at the end of the story. We're in the middle of it. The themes that run through Noah's narrative: environmental destruction, moral corruption, divine judgment, and the possibility of new beginnings are still being played out in our world today. The question isn't whether Noah's story really happened exactly as the Bible describes it. The question is whether we're willing to learn from it, to apply its lessons to our own lives and our own world. Are we willing to be people who maintain our integrity even when everyone else is cutting corners? Are we willing to be people who care for creation even when it is costly or inconvenient? Are we willing to be people who hope for new beginnings even when everything seems hopeless? Are we willing to be ark builders in our own generation? The story of Noah reminds us that individuals can make a difference, that faithfulness matters, that hope is realistic even in the darkest times. It reminds us that we're part of a larger story, that our choices have consequences not just for ourselves, but for future generations. Most importantly, it reminds us that we're not alone in this struggle. The God who walked with Noah, who preserved his family through the flood, who made a covenant with all creation, is still present in our world today. The rainbow is still a sign of hope, a promise that destruction doesn't have the final word. So as you go from here, as you face the challenges and opportunities of your own life, remember Noah's story. Remember that faithfulness is possible, even in corrupt times. Remember that hope is realistic, even in dark circumstances. Remember that new beginnings are always possible, even after the worst disasters. And remember that you are called to be an ark builder in your own generation, preserving what is valuable, protecting what is vulnerable, and maintaining hope for the future. The story of Noah isn't just ancient history. It is a template for faithful living in every generation. It is a reminder that with God, there is always hope for new beginnings, always possibility for redemption, always reason to build arks of hope in a world that desperately needs them. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of humanity's most enduring stories. If this deep dive into Noah's narrative has been helpful, inspiring, or challenging for you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want to explore more stories that have shaped human understanding of faith, hope, and meaning, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Until next time, keep building arks, keep watching for rainbows, and keep hoping for new beginnings. The story continues, and you are part of it. Now, let's dive into something that fascinates both believers and skeptics alike: the scientific evidence for Noah's flood. This is where faith meets geology, where ancient narratives intersect with modern archaeology, and where some of the most heated debates in science and religion take place. First, let's talk about the geological evidence. If there really was a worldwide flood that covered the entire Earth, we would expect to find certain types of evidence in the geological record. What do we actually find? Well, it is complicated. There is abundant evidence for massive flooding events throughout Earth's history, but the evidence for a single, simultaneous worldwide flood is much more limited. However, some geologists have pointed to interesting phenomena that might be relevant. The channeled scablands in Washington state show evidence of catastrophic flooding on a scale that was once thought impossible. The Missoula floods, caused by the breaking of ice dams during the last ice age, carved massive channels through solid rock in a matter of days or weeks. These floods were so powerful and so rapid that they changed how geologists think about catastrophic events. Dr. J. Harlan Bretz, the geologist who first proposed the catastrophic flooding theory for the scablands, was initially ridiculed by his colleagues who believed in slow, gradual geological processes. But the evidence was overwhelming. Only catastrophic flooding could explain the massive erosion patterns, the giant ripple marks, and the enormous boulders scattered across the landscape. This has led some geologists to reconsider whether other geological formations might be the result of catastrophic flooding rather than gradual processes. The Grand Canyon, for instance, shows evidence of rapid water erosion in some areas. Massive sedimentary layers found around the world sometimes show signs of rapid deposition rather than slow accumulation. But here is where it gets really interesting. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. In the 1990s, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed that the Black Sea was once a much smaller freshwater lake separated from the Mediterranean by a land bridge at the Bosporus. According to their theory, around 7,500 years ago, rising sea levels caused the Mediterranean to break through this land bridge, creating a massive waterfall that was 200 times more powerful than Niagara Falls. This catastrophic flooding would have raised the level of the Black Sea by hundreds of feet, flooding thousands of square miles of inhabited land. The timeline is fascinating. This would have occurred right around the time that many scholars date the historical events described in Genesis. The scale would have been unprecedented. Imagine living in a farming community around what is now the Black Sea, and suddenly witnessing a wall of water that destroys everything you've ever known. Recent underwater archaeology in the Black Sea has revealed evidence of ancient coastlines, submerged settlements, and even preserved wooden structures. The oxygen-poor deep waters of the Black Sea have preserved organic materials that would have rotted away elsewhere, creating a unique archaeological record. Could this Black Sea flood be the historical basis for the Noah story? It is possible. The flood would have been devastating for the people living in that region, but it wouldn't have been truly worldwide. From the perspective of the people experiencing it, though, it might have seemed like the whole world was being destroyed. Then there is the question of flood stories in other cultures. As I mentioned earlier, flood narratives appear in cultures all around the world, often with striking similarities to the biblical account. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in ancient Mesopotamia around 2100 BCE, tells the story of Utnapishtim, who builds a great ship to survive a flood sent by the gods. The similarities are remarkable. The gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood. One righteous man is warned. He builds a great boat. He takes his family and animals aboard. The flood covers the earth. The boat comes to rest on a mountain, and birds are sent out to find dry land. The parallels are so close that many scholars believe both stories are based on the same historical event. But it is not just in the Middle East. Hindu texts describe Manu, who saves humanity from a great flood by building a boat. Greek mythology tells of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survive a flood sent by Zeus. Norse mythology has a flood story. Native American tribes from across North America have flood stories. Aboriginal Australians have flood stories. Even cultures that developed in isolation from each other have remarkably similar flood narratives. This suggests one of two things: either there was some kind of catastrophic flooding event in human prehistory that got embedded in cultural memory across the globe, or the flood story represents something so fundamental about human experience that it appears independently in cultures that had no contact with each other. From an archaeological perspective, the search for Noah's Ark has been one of the most persistent and controversial quests in modern archaeology. Numerous expeditions have claimed to have found remains of the Ark on Mount Ararat in Turkey, but none of these claims have been substantiated by peer-reviewed scientific analysis. The challenges are enormous. Mount Ararat is over 16,000 feet high, covered in snow and ice for most of the year, and located in a politically sensitive border region. The conditions are harsh enough that even reaching the supposed location of the Ark requires advanced mountaineering skills and expensive equipment. More importantly, even if wooden remains were found at high altitude, proving that they're from Noah's Ark rather than from some other ancient structure would be nearly impossible. Wood degrades over time, and after 4,000–5,000 years, very little would remain even under ideal preservation conditions, but the search continues. Satellite imagery has revealed intriguing formations on Mount Ararat that some interpret as possible Ark remains. Ground-penetrating radar has detected what might be wooden structures buried under ice and rock, but without definitive physical evidence, the location of the Ark remains a mystery. Perhaps that is intentional. Perhaps the Ark isn't meant to be found. Perhaps its significance lies not in its physical remains, but in its spiritual meaning. The Ark represents salvation, preservation, and hope values that transcend archaeology and geology. Now let's tackle one of the most frequently asked questions about Noah's story: how could all the animals fit in the Ark? This is where the narrative intersects with zoology, animal behavior and logistics in fascinating ways. First, let's clarify what we're talking about. The Bible doesn't say Noah took every individual animal species. It says he took kinds of animals, and the Hebrew word min doesn't necessarily correspond to our modern biological classification of species. Modern taxonomy recognizes over 8.7 million species of animals, but many of these are insects, marine animals, and microscopic organisms that wouldn't need to be on the ark. Marine animals could survive in the floodwaters. Many insects could survive as eggs or larvae. Microscopic organisms would be virtually indestructible. When we focus on the types of animals that would actually need to be preserved land-dwelling, air-breathing vertebrates, the numbers become much more manageable. We're talking about mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. Even including all known species in these categories, we're looking at somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 species. But remember, Noah was told to take kinds, not species. Many modern species are the result of genetic variation within a broader category. For example, all dog breeds from Chihuahuas to Great Danes are the same species Canis lupus familiaris, and could theoretically be represented by a single breeding pair. Some creation scientists have proposed that Noah's kinds correspond roughly to the taxonomic level of family or genus, rather than species. This would mean that instead of taking hundreds of different bird species, Noah might have taken representatives of major bird families. And the tremendous diversity we see today developed through natural selection and genetic variation after the flood. This isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. We know that tremendous genetic diversity can be contained within a small population. The entire human population is descended from a relatively small group of ancestors. Yet we see enormous variation in human appearance, physiology, and capabilities. The same principle could apply to animals. A single pair of cats could potentially give rise to lions, tigers, house cats, and all the other members of the cat family through genetic variation and natural selection. A single pair of horses could give rise to zebras, donkeys, and domestic horses. But even if we accept this interpretation, we're still talking about thousands of animals. How could they all fit in the ark? Let's look at the dimensions again. The ark was 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Using the standard Hebrew cubit of about 18 inches, that is 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. The total volume would be approximately 1.5 million cubic feet, or about 43,000 cubic meters. That is enormous, roughly equivalent to 570 railroad boxcars, or 1,400 semi-truck trailers. To put it in perspective, it is about the same volume as a modern aircraft carrier, or a large cruise ship. But volume isn't the only consideration. The ark had 3 decks, which would provide about 95,000 square feet of floor space. That is more than 2 football fields of floor space, distributed across 3 levels. Now, let's think about the animals themselves. Most animals are much smaller than we might think. The average size of a mammal is about that of a rat. The average size of a bird is smaller than a chicken. Even among large animals, juveniles would take up much less space than adults, and they would be better able to adapt to the confined conditions. Young animals would also be more likely to survive the stress of confinement, more adaptable to new foods, and more capable of breeding successfully after the flood. It would make sense for Noah to take young animals rather than full-grown adults whenever possible. Some animals could also be represented by eggs rather than living creatures. Many reptiles and birds could be preserved in egg form, dramatically reducing the space requirements. Eggs are also much easier to store and care for than living animals. Then there is the question of food and water. How could Noah possibly store enough food to feed thousands of animals for over a year? Again, this depends on how we interpret the story. If the animals went into some kind of dormant state hibernation, estivation, or something similar, their food and water requirements would be dramatically reduced. Many animals naturally enter dormant states during times of environmental stress. The text mentions that Noah was told to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. This suggests that Noah was responsible for providing food, but it doesn't specify how much or what kind. Some animals are much more efficient than others in terms of food requirements. Ruminants like cattle, sheep, and goats can survive on relatively poor quality forage. Grain-eating animals like chickens and pigs can be fed on stored grains. Carnivores could potentially be fed on fish or other marine animals that wouldn't be in short supply during a worldwide flood. Water requirements could be met through rainwater collection during a 40-day rainstorm. Water shortage wouldn't be a problem. The bigger challenge would be storing and distributing the water throughout the ark. But here is where it gets really interesting from a behavioral perspective. How do you keep natural predators from eating their prey when they're confined in the same space? How do you keep territorial animals from fighting? How do you manage animals that are naturally nocturnal versus those that are diurnal? The Bible suggests that God brought the animals to Noah and that they entered the ark voluntarily. This implies some kind of supernatural influence on animal behavior. If God could direct animals to come to the ark, he could also direct them to behave peacefully while they were there. We see hints of this kind of supernatural influence on animal behavior elsewhere in the Bible. In the book of Daniel, lions refuse to attack Daniel when he is thrown into their den. In the book of Kings, ravens bring food to the prophet Elijah. In the New Testament, Jesus commands fish to swim into the disciples' nets. The idea isn't that God suspends natural laws, but that he can influence natural behavior in ways that serve his purposes. During the flood, it would have been necessary for normal predator-prey relationships to be suspended, at least temporarily. Some ancient Jewish commentators suggested that the animals entered a kind of covenant relationship with Noah and his family, agreeing to peaceful coexistence in exchange for preservation. This wouldn't be unlike the domestication process that humans have used with various animals throughout history. Others suggested that the animals were simply too stressed and frightened by the flood to engage in normal hunting behavior. When survival is at stake, many animals will cooperate with species they would normally consider enemies. Now let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in discussions of Noah's story: the psychological and emotional impact of being the sole survivors of a global catastrophe. This is where the narrative becomes deeply human, where we see the real cost of survival and the challenge of starting over. Imagine the psychological state of Noah's family as they watched the floodwaters rise. At first, there might have been some vindication. See, we were right to build this ark. People should have listened to us. But as the water continued to rise, as they watched their neighbors, their friends, their entire community disappear beneath the waves, any sense of vindication would have been overwhelmed by grief and horror. They were witnessing genocide on a scale that is hard to comprehend. Every person they had ever known was dying. Every place they had ever been was being destroyed. Their entire world was coming to an end, and they were powerless to stop it. This would have created what psychologists call survivor's guilt, the feeling that they somehow didn't deserve to survive when everyone else perished. Why them? What made them special? Why were they saved when others weren't? This psychological burden would have been compounded by the practical challenges of life on the ark. They were confined in a relatively small space, with thousands of animals for over a year. The noise would have been constant animals calling, moving around, expressing distress. The smell would have been overwhelming. The work would have been exhausting and never-ending. Sleep deprivation would have been a constant problem. Different animals are active at different times, so there would always be something that needed attention. The stress of maintaining the ark, caring for the animals, and dealing with their own emotional trauma would have pushed them to their physical and psychological limits. Then there is the question of relationships within the family. 8 people confined together for over a year, under the most stressful circumstances imaginable. Even the closest families would struggle with this kind of pressure. Conflicts would be inevitable. Tensions would build. The normal social structures that help people cope with stress would be absent. Noah was not just the patriarch of his family. He was also the captain of the ark, the caretaker of the animals, and the spiritual leader of the only believing community left on earth. The weight of that responsibility would have been crushing. Every decision he made would have life or death consequences for everyone and everything on the ark. His wife would have been dealing with her own grief and trauma while trying to hold the family together. She would have been the emotional anchor for the family. But who would be her emotional support? She would have been dealing with the loss of her friends, her community, her entire social network. The three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, would have been young adults, probably in their 20s or 30s. They would have been old enough to understand the magnitude of what was happening, but young enough to be emotionally dependent on their parents. They would have been dealing with their own grief while trying to figure out their roles in this new reality. The daughters-in-law would have been in an even more difficult position. They would have been separated from their own families, their own communities, their own support networks. They would have been dealing with grief, trauma, and uncertainty while trying to fit into a family structure that was itself under enormous stress. The isolation would have been particularly difficult. Human beings are social creatures. We need community, connection, and communication with others. For over a year, these 8 people had no contact with any other human beings. They were completely alone in the world. The uncertainty would have been equally challenging. They had no idea how long the flood would last, whether the ark would survive, or what they would find when it was over. They were living in a state of constant anxiety, not knowing what each day would bring. When the ark finally came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, the relief would have been enormous, but it would have been followed by a new set of psychological challenges. They were no longer in immediate danger, but they were still completely alone in the world. The process of sending out the birds and waiting for dry land would have been emotionally exhausting. Each failed attempt would have been a disappointment. Each delay would have increased the anxiety. When the dove finally returned with an olive leaf, it would have been a moment of incredible joy and relief. But even leaving the ark would have been psychologically difficult. The ark had been their home, their protection, their entire world for over a year. Leaving it would have meant facing the reality of the destroyed world outside. The first thing Noah did after leaving the ark was build an altar and offer sacrifices. This wasn't just religious duty, it was psychological necessity. He needed to make sense of what had happened, to find meaning in the destruction, to establish some kind of spiritual framework for moving forward. The sacrifice would have been a way of saying, thank you for their survival. But it would also have been a way of dealing with their grief and trauma. It would have been a ritual acknowledgement of what they had lost and what they had gained. The Rainbow Covenant would have been psychologically crucial for Noah's family. They needed reassurance that this wouldn't happen again, that they wouldn't have to live in constant fear of another flood. The rainbow would have been a visible reminder of God's promise, a source of comfort and hope, but the psychological effects of their experience would have lasted for the rest of their lives. They would have been dealing with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They would have had nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety attacks. They would have been hypervigilant about weather patterns, constantly watching for signs of another flood. Their children and grandchildren would have been affected too. The trauma of the flood would have been passed down through stories, through behavior patterns, through the family's collective memory. The flood would have shaped their worldview, their values, and their relationship with God. This psychological dimension of Noah's story is often overlooked, but it is crucial for understanding the full impact of the narrative. These weren't just generic righteous people. They were human beings dealing with extraordinary trauma and loss. Their story is not just about divine judgment and salvation. It is about the human cost of survival and the challenge of rebuilding after catastrophe. Now let's dive into the deeper theological questions raised by Noah's story. This is where the narrative intersects with fundamental questions about the nature of God, the problem of evil, and the meaning of divine justice. These are questions that have occupied theologians, philosophers, and believers for thousands of years. First, there is the question of divine justice. How can a loving God destroy virtually all of humanity? How can we reconcile the God of the flood with the God of love that Jesus reveals in the New Testament? This is one of the most challenging aspects of Noah's story for modern readers. We live in a culture that emphasizes God's love, mercy, and forgiveness. The idea of God as judge, executing judgment on a cosmic scale, makes many people uncomfortable. But the biblical narrative suggests that God's love and God's justice are not contradictory. They're complementary. Love without justice is mere sentimentality. Justice without love is mere cruelty. True love requires justice, because love cannot tolerate the destruction of what it loves. The pre-flood world had become so corrupt that it was destroying itself. The violence, oppression, and evil that characterized that civilization were not sustainable. If God had not intervened, humanity would have destroyed itself anyway. The flood was, in a sense, a mercy that prevented even greater suffering. But there is another way to think about this. The flood wasn't just about punishment, it was about preservation. God's primary concern wasn't destroying the wicked, but saving the righteous. Noah and his family were preserved not because they were perfect, but because they were the only ones who maintained any connection to God's purposes. This raises questions about divine election and predestination. Why Noah? Why his family? What made them special? The text suggests that Noah was righteous, in his generation, meaning he was righteous compared to his contemporaries. But does this mean he was righteous by absolute standards? Some theologians argue that Noah's righteousness was not inherent, but imputed that God declared him righteous, not because of his moral perfection, but because of his faith. This would make Noah's story a precursor to the doctrine of justification, by faith that becomes central to Christian theology. Others argue that Noah's righteousness was genuine, but limited that he was truly righteous, but not perfectly righteous. This would make him a representative of the best that humanity can achieve through moral effort and divine grace. The Rainbow Covenant raises additional theological questions. God promises never again to destroy the earth with a flood, but this is an unconditional promise. It doesn't depend on human behavior or faithfulness. This suggests that God's covenant love is not contingent on human performance. But what about other forms of divine judgment? The promise is specifically about floods, not about judgment in general. The Bible records numerous other instances of divine judgment after the flood: the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the plagues of Egypt, the conquest of Canaan. So how do we understand the relationship between the Rainbow Covenant and these other acts of judgment? Some theologians suggest that the Rainbow Covenant represents a fundamental shift in how God relates to humanity. Before the flood, God dealt with humanity as a whole. After the flood, God deals with specific communities, nations, and individuals. The judgment becomes more focused, more targeted, more redemptive. Others suggest that the Rainbow Covenant represents God's commitment to working through natural processes, rather than supernatural intervention. After the flood, God generally works through human agents, natural consequences, and historical processes, rather than direct divine action. Then there is the question of animal death. If the flood was divine judgment for human sin, why did innocent animals have to suffer? What did the animals do to deserve destruction? This touches on one of the most difficult questions in theology: the problem of animal suffering. The biblical narrative suggests that the corruption of humanity affected the entire created order. When humans failed in their role as stewards of creation, the whole ecosystem became corrupted. The flood wasn't just about human sin. It was about the restoration of the created order. The animals that died in the flood were part of a corrupted system that needed to be cleansed and renewed. The animals that survived in the ark were the foundation for a new, restored creation. But this raises questions about the nature of animal consciousness and moral responsibility. Do animals have souls? Are they morally responsible for their actions? What does it mean for creation to be corrupted by human sin? Different theological traditions have different answers to these questions. Some see animals as purely material beings without souls or moral consciousness. Others see them as having a kind of limited consciousness that makes them capable of suffering but not of moral responsibility. Still others see them as having a form of spiritual existence that connects them to the divine purpose. The preservation of animals in the ark suggests that they have value beyond their utility to humans. God cares about biodiversity, about the preservation of species, about the continuation of the natural order. This has implications for how we think about environmental ethics and our responsibility as stewards of creation. The story also raises questions about the nature of divine omniscience and omnipotence. If God knows everything, why did he regret making humanity? If God is all-powerful, Why did he need to use a flood to accomplish his purposes? Some theologians interpret God's regret as anthropomorphic language, a way of describing God's response to human sin, in terms that humans can understand. God doesn't literally change his mind, but he responds to changed circumstances in ways that appear to humans as changes of mind. Others interpret it as evidence that God genuinely experiences emotion and change, that divine omniscience doesn't preclude divine responsiveness. This opens up questions about the nature of divine immutability and the relationship between divine sovereignty and human freedom. The question of divine omnipotence is equally complex. Could God have accomplished his purposes without the flood? Could he have changed human hearts instead of destroying human bodies? Why did he choose this particular method of judgment and restoration? Some theologians argue that the flood was the only way to accomplish God's purposes, given the constraints of human freedom and natural law. God couldn't force people to be righteous without violating their freedom, so he had to work within the consequences of their choices. Others argue that the flood was one option among many, chosen for reasons that we may not fully understand. God's ways are not our ways, and his purposes may be accomplished through means that seem harsh or mysterious to us. Now let's examine Noah's story from an anthropological perspective. How does this narrative reflect and shape human culture, social structures, and collective memory? This is where the story intersects with our understanding of human society, cultural development, and the role of myth in shaping civilizations. From an anthropological standpoint, flood myths are remarkably widespread across human cultures. They appear in societies that had no apparent contact with each other in geographical regions that experienced different types of flooding, and in time periods separated by thousands of years. This suggests that flood narratives serve important cultural functions beyond simple historical recording. Flood myths typically follow a similar pattern: divine displeasure with human behavior, warning given to a chosen individual or family, catastrophic flood that destroys most of humanity, preservation of the righteous through divine intervention, and renewal of the world through the survivors. This pattern appears in Mesopotamian, Greek, Hindu, Norse, Native American, and many other cultural traditions. From an anthropological perspective, these stories serve several important functions. They provide explanations for natural phenomena that ancient peoples couldn't understand through scientific observation. They establish moral frameworks by demonstrating the consequences of righteous and unrighteous behavior. They create social cohesion by giving communities shared narratives about their origins and values. But flood myths also serve psychological functions. They help people process trauma, deal with existential anxiety, and maintain hope in the face of overwhelming circumstances. They provide frameworks for understanding suffering, loss, and renewal that are essential for human psychological health. The Noah story specifically reflects several important anthropological themes. The emphasis on family structures and kinship relationships reflects the importance of extended family units in ancient societies. The role of Noah as patriarch, priest, and leader reflects the concentration of authority in elder males that characterized many ancient cultures. The preservation of animals reflects the dependence of ancient societies on domesticated animals for survival. The covenant with creation reflects the understanding that human welfare is intimately connected to environmental health. The emphasis on sacrifice and worship reflects the central role of religious ritual in ancient social organization. The story also reflects ancient understandings of divine human relationships. The idea that gods communicate directly with humans, that divine favor depends on human behavior, and that cosmic events reflect spiritual realities were common themes in ancient Near Eastern cultures. But Noah's story also contains elements that set it apart from typical flood myths. The emphasis on monotheism rather than polytheism, the focus on moral rather than ritual purity, and the universal rather than tribal scope of the covenant reflect distinctive theological developments that would influence later religious traditions. From a social anthropological perspective, the story reflects the transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural societies. Noah's post-flood activities, farming, animal husbandry, and viticulture, represent the foundational activities of agricultural civilizations. The story can be read as a narrative about the origins of civilized society, after a period of chaos and destruction. The story also reflects ancient understandings of social stratification and ethnic relationships. The blessings and curses pronounced on Noah's sons are interpreted as explaining the relationships between different ethnic groups and cultural traditions. While these interpretations have been misused to justify racism and oppression, they originally reflected ancient peoples' attempts to understand cultural diversity and social hierarchy. The preservation of different animal species reflects ancient understandings of biodiversity and ecological balance. The emphasis on taking pairs of animals reflects the understanding that species reproduction requires genetic diversity. The distinction between clean and unclean animals reflects the development of dietary laws and ritual practices that would become central to later religious traditions. From a psychological anthropological perspective, the story reflects universal human experiences of trauma, loss, and renewal. The flood represents the ultimate catastrophe, the destruction of everything familiar and secure. The ark represents the hope of survival and preservation. The rainbow represents the promise of restoration and renewal. These psychological themes resonate across cultures because they reflect fundamental human experiences. Everyone faces loss, trauma, and uncertainty. Everyone needs hope for survival and renewal. Everyone seeks meaning in the face of suffering and chaos. The story also reflects the importance of collective memory in human societies. The flood becomes a reference point for understanding later events, a standard for measuring moral behavior, and a source of identity for the community that preserves the story. In Jewish tradition, the flood becomes a symbol of divine judgment and the importance of righteousness. In Christian tradition, it becomes a symbol of salvation and the importance of faith. In Islamic tradition, it becomes a symbol of prophetic warning and the importance of submission to divine will. The story continues to influence modern culture in ways that reflect its anthropological significance. Environmental movements draw on the story's themes of stewardship and preservation. Disaster preparedness reflects the story's emphasis on wise planning and divine warning. Social justice movements draw on the story's themes of divine judgment against oppression and violence. The search for Noah's Ark reflects the human desire to connect abstract narratives with concrete evidence. The popularity of flood-themed movies and literature reflects the story's continued psychological resonance. The use of rainbow symbolism in various social movements reflects the story's themes of hope and covenant. Now let's explore how Noah's story has influenced literature, art, and popular culture throughout history. This is where the ancient narrative becomes a living tradition, inspiring creativity and imagination across centuries and cultures. In literature, Noah's story has inspired countless works across genres and time periods. Medieval mystery plays often featured Noah as a central character, depicting both his righteousness and his very human struggles with doubt and family conflict. These plays made the biblical narrative accessible to illiterate audiences while adding psychological depth and dramatic tension. During the Renaissance, writers like John Milton drew on Noah's story in works like Paradise Lost. Milton's epic poem includes extensive references to the flood, as part of humanity's fall from grace and God's plan for redemption. The flood becomes a central event in the cosmic drama of human history. In the Romantic period, poets like Lord Byron used the flood as a symbol of divine judgment and human hubris. Byron's poem, Heaven and Earth Reimagines, the flood story as a tragic love story between angels and humans, exploring themes of forbidden love and divine justice. Modern literature has continued to find inspiration in Noah's story. Writers like Joseph Saramago in The Stone Raft and Jeanette Winterson in Boating for Beginners have used the flood narrative as a framework for exploring contemporary themes of environmental destruction, social upheaval, and spiritual crisis. Science fiction writers have been particularly drawn to Noah's story as a template for survival narratives. The Ark becomes a spaceship, the flood becomes a nuclear war or environmental catastrophe, and Noah becomes a visionary leader who preserves humanity's future. These stories reflect our contemporary anxieties about technology, environment, and social collapse. In visual art, Noah's story has been one of the most frequently depicted biblical narratives. Medieval illuminated manuscripts often featured elaborate depictions of the Ark, showing it as a floating cathedral complete with architectural details and symbolic decorations. Renaissance artists like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael created masterpieces depicting various scenes from Noah's story. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling includes multiple scenes from Noah's life, including the drunkenness episode that reveals the complexity of human nature even after divine salvation. The Dutch Golden Age produced numerous paintings of Noah's Ark, often focusing on the animals entering the Ark. These paintings reflected the period's interest in natural history and exploration, as well as theological themes of salvation and divine providence. Modern and contemporary artists have continued to find inspiration in Noah's story. Marc Chagall's paintings often featured Noah and the Ark as symbols of Jewish survival and divine protection. Contemporary artists like Gerhard Richter and Anselm Kiefer have used flood imagery to explore themes of destruction, renewal, and historical trauma. In music, Noah's story has inspired compositions ranging from simple folk songs to complex orchestral works. Spirituals like Noah Built the Ark and Didn't It Rain use the flood narrative to explore themes of faith, perseverance, and divine justice. These songs were particularly meaningful to enslaved African Americans, who saw parallels between their own experiences of oppression and the biblical narrative of judgment and salvation. Classical composers have also drawn on Noah's story. Benjamin Britten's Noye's Flood is a church opera that tells the flood story using a combination of professional and amateur performers, creating a community event that reflects the story's themes of collective survival and divine grace. Contemporary musicians continue to find inspiration in Noah's story. Bob Dylan's The Times They Are a Changin' includes references to the flood as a symbol of social transformation. Heavy metal bands have used flood imagery to explore themes of apocalypse and renewal. Hip-hop artists have drawn on Noah's story to address contemporary issues of environmental destruction and social justice. In film and television, Noah's story has been adapted numerous times, each adaptation reflecting the concerns and perspectives of its time. Early Hollywood films like Noah's Ark 1928 used the flood story as a framework for exploring themes of moral redemption and divine justice. More recent films like Darren Aronofsky's Noah 2014 have reimagined the story for contemporary audiences, exploring themes of environmental destruction, family conflict, and psychological trauma. These adaptations often emphasize the human cost of divine judgment and the complexity of moral decision-making. Television series have also drawn on Noah's story, often using it as a framework for exploring contemporary issues. Animated series for children have used the story to teach lessons about environmental stewardship, family cooperation, and moral responsibility. In popular culture, Noah's story has become a reference point for discussing environmental issues, disaster preparedness, and social justice. The phrase Noah's Ark is used to describe any effort to preserve endangered species or cultural traditions. The rainbow flag has become a symbol of diversity and inclusion, drawing on the story's themes of covenant and hope. The story has also influenced architecture and design. Churches around the world have been designed to resemble the Ark, with curved roofs and ship-like features. The Ark Encounter in Kentucky is a full-scale replica of Noah's Ark that serves as both tourist attraction and religious education center. Theme parks and museums have created exhibits based on Noah's story, often focusing on the animals and the practical challenges of life on the Ark. These exhibits reflect the story's continued fascination for both believers and skeptics, as well as its educational value for teaching about ancient cultures and natural history. The story has also influenced children's literature and educational materials. Countless children's books have retold Noah's story, often emphasizing themes of obedience, family cooperation, and environmental stewardship. These books help introduce young readers to complex theological and ethical concepts through an engaging narrative. Noah's story has even influenced technology and engineering. The design principles used in the Ark focusing on stability rather than speed. Compartmentalization for safety and efficient use of space have influenced modern ship design and disaster response planning. Chapter 19. The environmental message. Now, let's examine one of the most relevant aspects of Noah's story for our contemporary world, its profound environmental message. In an age of climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecological crisis, Noah's narrative speaks with unprecedented urgency and relevance to our modern situation. The story of Noah presents one of humanity's earliest and most comprehensive environmental narratives. At its core, it is a tale about the consequences of human behavior on the natural world and the responsibility we bear as stewards of creation. When we examine the biblical account, we find that the flood wasn't merely divine punishment for human wickedness in general, but specifically for the corruption and violence that had infected all of creation. The Hebrew text uses the word shachath to describe the condition of the earth before the flood, a word that means corrupted, destroyed, or ruined. This same word is used to describe both human moral corruption and the physical destruction of the natural world. The text suggests that human moral failure had resulted in ecological catastrophe, a connection that resonates powerfully with our contemporary understanding of environmental crisis. Noah's role as the preserver of biodiversity makes him history's first recorded conservationist. The divine command to take 2 of every kind, or in some interpretations, 7 pairs of clean animals and 2 pairs of unclean animals, represents a systematic effort to preserve the genetic diversity necessary for ecosystem recovery. This wasn't random selection, but careful conservation planning, ensuring that every species had the genetic material needed to rebuild viable populations. The story's emphasis on preserving both clean and unclean animals offers a remarkable ecological insight. From a human perspective, some creatures might seem useless or even harmful, but the narrative insists that every species has value and deserves preservation. This anticipates modern ecological understanding of food webs, ecosystem services, and the intrinsic value of biodiversity. The Ark itself can be understood as the world's first nature reserve, a carefully designed space dedicated to preserving life through an environmental catastrophe. The detailed specifications given in the biblical account reflect serious consideration of the practical challenges involved in maintaining a diverse ecosystem in a confined space. The multiple decks, the window for light and air, the waterproofing with pitch. All these details suggest sophisticated understanding of the requirements for sustaining life. The feeding and care of the animals on the Ark raises important questions about human responsibility toward other species. Noah and his family had to dedicate themselves entirely to the welfare of creatures that provided them no immediate benefit. This represents a profound shift from viewing animals merely as resources to be exploited towards seeing them as fellow creatures deserving of care and protection. The story also speaks to questions of environmental justice. The flood affects all creatures, not just humans, highlighting the interconnectedness of all life. The righteous suffer alongside the wicked, the innocent animals alongside the guilty humans. This reflects the reality that environmental degradation affects all of creation, often impacting the most vulnerable disproportionately. The Rainbow Covenant at the story's end establishes one of the earliest recorded environmental treaties. God promises never again to destroy the earth by flood, but this covenant includes all living creatures, not just humans. The rainbow becomes a symbol of divine commitment to the integrity of creation and the cycles of nature. This covenant suggests that environmental protection is not merely human responsibility, but part of the divine order. Modern environmental movements have increasingly turned to Noah's story as a source of inspiration and authority. The concept of Noah's Ark has become synonymous with conservation efforts, from seed banks preserving genetic diversity to wildlife refuges protecting endangered species. The story provides a religious foundation for environmental activism, suggesting that caring for creation is a sacred duty. Climate change activists have found particular resonance in Noah's story. Like Noah, they warn of coming environmental catastrophe and call for urgent action to preserve life on Earth. The story's emphasis on preparing for disaster and taking responsibility for other species speaks directly to contemporary environmental challenges. The story also addresses the psychological and spiritual dimensions of environmental crisis. Noah's long wait in the Ark, sending out birds to test for dry land, reflects the anxiety and uncertainty that accompanies environmental catastrophe. The story acknowledges that environmental recovery is a slow process that requires patience, faith, and continued vigilance. Chapter 20. psychological, and spiritual dimensions. Beyond its environmental message, Noah's story offers profound insights into the human psyche and spiritual journey. The narrative explores themes of isolation, leadership, faith, and the psychological burden of survival that resonate deeply with human experience across cultures and centuries. Noah's calling represents one of the most psychologically challenging scenarios imaginable. He receives a divine revelation that the world as he knows it will end, and he alone is chosen to preserve life for the future. This places him in the position of being both witness to global catastrophe and responsible for humanity's survival. The psychological weight of such knowledge and responsibility is almost incomprehensible. The story presents Noah as a figure of faith, but not naive faith. His obedience to the divine command to build the ark requires him to act on information that contradicts all available evidence. There is no sign of coming flood, no scientific data supporting the need for such dramatic action. Noah must build and provision an enormous vessel, based purely on divine revelation, likely facing ridicule and skepticism from his contemporaries. This aspect of the story speaks to the psychology of prophetic consciousness, the burden of seeing what others cannot see, of knowing what others refuse to acknowledge. Noah becomes a prototype for all who must act on conviction, rather than consensus, who must prepare for futures that others consider impossible or irrelevant. The isolation aspect of Noah's story is particularly profound. As floodwaters rise and the ark begins to float, Noah and his family become the only human survivors in a world suddenly emptied of human life. The psychological impact of such complete isolation cannot be overstated. They are surrounded by death, cut off from all familiar landscapes and communities, floating in a world that has become utterly alien. The story explores how this isolation affects family dynamics. Confined in the ark with only each other for company, Noah's family must navigate the intense psychological pressure of their situation. The close quarters, the constant responsibility for the animals, the uncertainty about the future. All of these factors create a pressure cooker environment that tests family bonds and individual resilience. Noah's role as patriarch and leader is complicated by these extraordinary circumstances. He must maintain authority and purpose while dealing with his own fears and uncertainties. The story suggests that leadership in crisis requires not just decisive action, but the ability to maintain hope and direction when the future is completely unknown. The psychological aspects of waiting are central to the story's spiritual message. After the rain stops, Noah and his family must wait for the waters to recede. This waiting period represents one of the most challenging aspects of the entire ordeal. The immediate crisis of the flood has passed, but the resolution seems to stretch endlessly. The story captures the psychological difficulty of this liminal period, no longer in immediate danger, but not yet safe, no longer in the familiar world, but not yet in the new one. The sending of the birds, first the raven, then the dove, represents Noah's attempts to understand and connect with the world beyond the ark. These birds become extensions of his consciousness, exploring the world he cannot yet see. The dove's return with an olive branch becomes one of the most powerful symbols of hope in human culture, representing the first sign that life is returning to the devastated world. The story also explores the spiritual dimension of survival guilt. Noah and his family are preserved while the rest of humanity perishes. This creates a complex psychological situation where gratitude for survival mixes with grief for the lost world and perhaps guilt about their special preservation. The story suggests that survival itself can be a form of spiritual burden, requiring those who are saved to live worthy of their preservation. Noah's actions after leaving the ark reveal the ongoing psychological impact of his experience. His first act is to build an altar and offer sacrifice, suggesting both gratitude and the need for spiritual purification after witnessing such destruction. The story acknowledges that traumatic experiences leave lasting marks on the psyche and require ongoing spiritual work to process and integrate. The episode of Noah's drunkenness, often glossed over in popular retellings, provides crucial insight into the psychological aftermath of trauma. Even righteous Noah, the hero of the story, struggles with the psychological burden of his experiences. His drunkenness can be understood as a form of self-medication, an attempt to escape the weight of memory and responsibility. This episode also explores generational trauma and the ways that parents' experiences affect their children. Ham's response to seeing his father's nakedness and Noah's subsequent curse suggests that trauma can be transmitted across generations and that family healing requires careful attention to boundaries and respect. The story's spiritual dimensions extend beyond individual psychology to cosmic questions about divine justice, human responsibility, and the nature of evil. Noah's experience forces him to confront fundamental questions about why suffering exists and what role humans play in cosmic justice. The story suggests that spiritual maturity involves accepting responsibility for outcomes beyond our complete understanding or control. Chapter 21. Cultural Variations and Global Perspectives. Noah's story, while rooted in ancient Hebrew tradition, has parallels and variations across cultures worldwide, suggesting that the narrative addresses universal human concerns about catastrophe, survival, and renewal. Examining these global perspectives reveals both the universality of flood narratives and the unique cultural insights each tradition brings to understanding human relationship with nature and the divine. The Mesopotamian flood narratives, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh, predate the biblical account and share remarkable similarities with Noah's story. Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian flood survivor, receives divine warning, builds a boat, saves his family and animals, and sends out birds to test for dry land. However, the cultural context and theological implications differ significantly from the biblical account. In the Mesopotamian version, the flood results from divine caprice and conflict among the gods, rather than moral judgment. The gods decide to destroy humanity because they have become too numerous and noisy, disturbing divine rest. This reflects a different understanding of the relationship between divine and human realms, where humans are more like unwanted tenants than moral agents, whose choices matter to the cosmic order. The Hindu tradition contains multiple flood narratives, most notably the story of Manu, who saves humanity and animals from a great deluge, with the help of a great fish, later revealed to be the god Vishnu. This story emphasizes the cyclical nature of creation and destruction, viewing the flood not as unique catastrophe, but as part of the eternal rhythm of cosmic dissolution and renewal. The Buddhist tradition includes flood stories that emphasize the role of karma and moral action in determining cosmic events. In these narratives, floods result from collective negative karma, and survival depends on accumulated merit and spiritual development. This places greater emphasis on individual spiritual preparation and the moral dimensions of survival. Indigenous traditions across the Americas contain numerous flood narratives that often emphasize the relationship between humans and specific animal helpers. In many Native American traditions, certain animals warn humans of coming floods or help them survive the catastrophe. These stories often include detailed knowledge of local geography and ecology, suggesting that they may preserve memories of actual historical floods. The Ojibwe tradition tells of Nanabojo, a cultural hero who survives a great flood with the help of various animals. The story emphasizes cooperation between humans and animals and the importance of maintaining proper relationships with all beings. The renewal after the flood involves recreating the world through partnership between human and animal powers. Australian Aboriginal traditions include flood stories that often involve the rainbow serpent, a powerful creator deity associated with water and weather. These stories emphasize the connection between moral behavior and environmental conditions, suggesting that floods result from violations of traditional law and proper relationship with the land. The Maori tradition of New Zealand includes flood narratives that emphasize the role of cultural heroes who must master both spiritual and practical knowledge to survive catastrophe. These stories often involve detailed knowledge of navigation, weather patterns, and resource management, reflecting the maritime culture's sophisticated understanding of environmental challenges. African traditions contain numerous flood narratives that often emphasize community cooperation and the importance of maintaining proper relationships with ancestors and spiritual forces. In many African cultures, floods are understood as consequences of social disruption or failure to maintain proper ritual practices. The Greek tradition includes flood stories associated with Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survive a flood sent by Zeus to punish human wickedness. This story emphasizes themes of moral purification and the renewal of human civilization through divine intervention. The survivors must literally recreate humanity by throwing stones that become people, emphasizing the idea of starting over completely. Norse mythology includes flood narratives associated with Ragnarok, the end of the world, where most gods and humans perish, but a few survive to establish a new world order. These stories emphasize the cyclical nature of destruction and renewal, and the importance of wisdom and courage in facing inevitable catastrophe. These cultural variations reveal different approaches to understanding the relationship between human behavior and environmental catastrophe. Some emphasize moral causation, others cosmic cycles, and still others the importance of maintaining proper relationships with spiritual forces and natural systems. The global distribution of flood narratives suggests that they address universal human concerns about catastrophe and survival. All cultures must grapple with the reality that environmental disasters can destroy entire civilizations, and that human survival depends on both practical preparation and spiritual resources. These stories also reveal different cultural approaches to understanding divine justice and human responsibility. Some cultures emphasize individual moral accountability, others collective responsibility, and still others the importance of maintaining proper relationships with spiritual forces and natural systems. The practical details in these stories often reflect sophisticated understanding of survival techniques, environmental conditions, and resource management. Many flood narratives include detailed information about boat construction, food preservation, animal care, and weather prediction that reflects accumulated cultural wisdom about disaster preparedness. Modern comparative study of flood narratives has revealed their role in preserving cultural memory of actual historical events. Many flood stories contain geographical and ecological details that correspond to known environmental changes, suggesting that they may preserve memories of actual catastrophic floods that occurred as Ice Age glaciers melted and sea levels rose. Chapter 22. Modern relevance and future implications. As we conclude our exploration of Noah's story, it is essential to examine its ongoing relevance and implications for our contemporary world. The narrative continues to speak powerfully to current global challenges, offering both warning and hope for humanity's future relationship with the natural world and each other. The story's environmental message has never been more urgent. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecological degradation create conditions remarkably similar to those described in Noah's time, a world where human behavior threatens the survival of all life. The scientific consensus on climate change echoes the divine warning Noah received. Catastrophic change is coming, and urgent action is needed to preserve life on Earth. Modern conservation efforts explicitly draw on Noah's example. Seed banks, like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, are often called Noah's Arks for their role in preserving genetic diversity against potential catastrophe. These facilities recognize that human activities have created conditions where systematic preservation of species and genetic material has become necessary for life's survival. The story's emphasis on preserving both clean and unclean animals speaks directly to contemporary debates about conservation priorities. Should we focus resources on charismatic megafauna that capture public attention, or should we prioritize less visible species that may be more crucial for ecosystem function? Noah's inclusive approach suggests that all species deserve preservation, regardless of their apparent utility to humans. The psychological dimensions of Noah's story resonate with contemporary experiences of environmental anxiety and climate grief. Many people today, particularly young people, experience feelings similar to Noah's burden, knowing that environmental catastrophe is approaching while feeling powerless to prevent it. The story offers both validation of these feelings and a model for constructive response. The story's exploration of leadership in crisis has profound implications for contemporary environmental and political leadership. Noah's example suggests that effective leadership requires the ability to act on long-term vision, rather than short-term political considerations, to maintain hope and direction in the face of uncertainty, and to take responsibility for outcomes that extend far beyond one's immediate community. The international cooperation required to address climate change mirrors the cooperative effort needed to maintain the Ark. Noah's family had to work together despite their close quarters and high stress levels. Similarly, Addressing global environmental challenges requires unprecedented cooperation between nations, communities, and individuals who may have different immediate interests, but share a common fate. The story's emphasis on patient waiting and gradual recovery speaks to the reality that environmental healing is a slow process. Even after we stop destructive behaviors, ecosystems require time to recover. The story suggests that this waiting period requires continued vigilance and care. Just as Noah continued to tend the animals and monitor conditions, even after the rain stopped. The Rainbow Covenant at the story's end offers a model for environmental treaties and agreements. The covenant recognizes that environmental protection requires commitment from all parties, divine and human, individual and collective. Modern environmental agreements like the Paris Climate Accord attempt to create similar frameworks for shared responsibility and mutual accountability. The story's exploration of generational responsibility is particularly relevant to contemporary environmental challenges. Noah's actions were motivated not just by immediate survival, but by responsibility to future generations. Climate change similarly requires current generations to make sacrifices for the benefit of future generations, who will inherit the consequences of our choices. Educational applications of Noah's story continue to evolve. Environmental education programs use the narrative to teach children about biodiversity, conservation, and human responsibility for the natural world. The story provides a framework for discussing complex environmental issues in age-appropriate ways, while emphasizing both human agency and the importance of caring for other species. The story's technological implications extend beyond conservation to disaster preparedness and sustainable design. The Ark's design principles, stability over speed, compartmentalization for safety, efficient use of space influence modern approaches to emergency shelter design, sustainable architecture, and disaster response planning. Urban planning increasingly draws on Noah's example in designing cities that can survive environmental catastrophe. Green infrastructure, flood management systems, and sustainable transportation networks all reflect principles implicit in Noah's story. The need to design human settlements that work with natural systems rather than against them. The story's spiritual dimensions offer resources for environmental ethics and activism. Many faith communities have embraced creation care as a central religious obligation, drawing on Noah's example to argue that environmental protection is a sacred duty. This religious foundation for environmental activism provides motivation and community support for sustained environmental action. The story also speaks to questions of environmental justice and global equity. The flood affects all creatures equally, regardless of their moral status or social position. This reflects the reality that environmental degradation often affects the most vulnerable populations disproportionately, requiring special attention to equity and justice in environmental solutions. As we face an uncertain environmental future, Noah's story offers both warning and hope. The warning is clear. Human behavior can create conditions that threaten all life on Earth. The hope is equally clear, with wisdom, cooperation, and commitment to preserving life. Humans can navigate even the most challenging environmental crises. The story suggests that environmental catastrophe, while devastating, is not necessarily the end of the story. Recovery is possible, but it requires sustained effort, patience, and commitment to doing things differently. The new world that emerges after the flood is not identical to the old world, but represents a fresh start based on hard-won wisdom. Ultimately, Noah's story remains relevant because it addresses fundamental questions about human nature, divine justice, environmental responsibility, and the possibilities for renewal after catastrophe. As we face our own environmental challenges, the story offers both practical wisdom and spiritual resources for navigating an uncertain future, while maintaining hope for life's continuation and flourishing. The narrative reminds us that we are both capable of creating conditions that threaten life and capable of taking actions that preserve and protect life. The choice, as always, remains ours.